It was a calm Tuesday evening, the living room dimly illuminated by the flicker of the television, but Hector wasn't paying attention. He sat on the couch, lost in his thoughts, absent-mindedly swirling the beer bottle in his hand. The muffled sounds of drawers opening and closing from upstairs had become something he was used to over the past few weeks. Every night, Sophia would retreat upstairs, preparing for something somewhere, but never for him. Tonight, however, the atmosphere felt different. The rustling from the bedroom was more urgent, almost frantic. Hector sighed, tightening his grip on the beer bottle. His patience had been wearing thin for a while. He knew something was off and had sensed it for months. The creak of the stairs interrupted his thoughts, and when he looked up, what he saw made his breath hitch. Sophia stood halfway down the stairs in a bright red bikini, her skin glistening in the soft light, her long hair cascading over her shoulders. It wasn't the type of attire you'd expect your wife to wear in the middle of the night, especially when the two of you were alone in the house. "What the hell is this?" Hector blurted, sitting upright as the beer bottle slipped from his hand, hitting the floor with a soft thud. His voice was a mix of shock and anger. Sophia stopped, placing her hand on the railing, and glanced down at him with a smirk that turned his stomach. "It's for him," she said flatly, her eyes filled with disdain. "What the hell do you mean?" Hector demanded, his pulse quickening as he stood, his voice cracking under the weight of his growing rage. Sophia descended the stairs, slow and deliberate. "My lover," she said, as though it should have been obvious. "It's a bikini-themed party, and he likes me in this." She reached the bottom of the stairs, her heels clicking softly against the hardwood as she crossed the room. She didn't bother looking at him, speaking as though he were a stranger in his own home. "You've got to be kidding me," Hector muttered, shaking his head as disbelief turned to cold, hard anger. "You think this is okay?" "You wouldn't understand," Sophia interrupted, finally turning to face him. "You've never been the kind of man who knows how to treat a woman like me." Her words hit him like a punch. He had known their relationship wasn't perfect, but this? For years he had worked hard to build a life with her. They weren't wealthy, but they had enough. At least he had thought so. Hector clenched his fists, struggling to keep calm. "Where do you think you're going?" he asked, his voice low and controlled, despite the fury growing inside him. To meet him, Sophia scoffed, tossing her hair over her shoulder. "Do you honestly think you can stop me?" Her defiance made his blood boil. He took a step toward her, heart pounding. "I swear to God," he said, his voice trembling with rage, "if you step out of this house, I'll break your legs." The threat hung in the air, heavy and real. Sophia stopped, fully facing him, the smirk gone from her lips. Silence filled the room, the tension between them thick. Then, slowly, a new smile appeared, cold and mocking. "You can't control me, Hector," she said, her tone dripping with contempt. "You're a loser. You can barely afford a McDonald's meal, let alone keep me here." Her words were like a sledgehammer, each one driving deeper into his chest. He had heard her belittle him before, but never like this. Now her cruelty was fully exposed, without any pretense. "You really think that guy cares about you?" Hector shot back, his voice sharp and bitter. "You think he's in love with you, or is it just about what you're giving him?" Sophia let out a cold, mocking laugh. "He buys me designer bags, luxury clothes, things you could never dream of affording." "Look at you," she said, her eyes sweeping over him with disdain. "Look at the pathetic life you've built. You're a joke." The venom in her words was palpable, and it left Hector stunned. He had never felt so small, so utterly crushed under the weight of her insults. Sophia turned and headed for the front door, her heels clicking again on the floor. She didn't even grab a coat, didn't care that it was late, or that her outfit was inappropriate for anything but a pool party. As she reached for the doorknob, Hector found his voice. "You're making a mistake, Sophia," he said, his tone flat but firm. "That guy, he's going to use you and then leave you with nothing." She paused, hand on the knob, and turned just enough to glance at him from the corner of her eye. "You know what, Hector," she said softly, her voice cruel. "Even if that happens, it'll still be better than staying here with you." Before he could reply, the door swung open, and she stepped out into the night, her laughter lingering in the air like a taunt. The door slammed behind her, the sound echoing through the now empty house. Hector stood there, staring at the door, his mind reeling. A hollow sensation grew in his chest as the realization set in the life he thought he had built was falling apart. The silence in the house was suffocating. He sank back onto the couch, the weight of her betrayal pressing down on him like an anchor. How had it come to this? The woman he had trusted and loved was flaunting her affair as if he were nothing. Leaning forward, elbows on his knees, he stared blankly at the floor. What had once been a home now felt like a prison. Her laughter echoed in his head, taunting him, each memory sharper than the last. He replayed the past few months in his mind, the late nights, the unexplained messages, the sudden disinterest. It all made sense now, and it turned his stomach. He exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair, trying to calm the storm of emotions inside him. The quiet hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen was the only sound in the room until a familiar chime from his phone broke the silence. He reached for it, expecting a routine notification or email, but what he saw on the screen made his heart skip a beat. It was Sophia's number, and the subject of the message was unsettling in its simplicity. "Hey, loser. Thought you'd want to see this." He hesitated, a knot forming in his stomach, before he tapped to open it. There was no text, just a video file. His thumb hovered over the play button. A part of him didn't want to know, didn't want to confirm the awful suspicions that had been gnawing at him for months, but he had to see it. He needed to know the truth, no matter how painful it might be. The video started playing, and instantly his blood froze. There was Sophia, laughing, wearing that same red bikini from earlier. She sat atop another man, moving provocatively, her arms wrapped around his neck as they kissed, completely oblivious to anything else. They caressed each other in a lavish hotel room, the expensive decor mocking the modest, hard-earned life Hector had built. His stomach churned as a wave of nausea hit. The woman he had loved for years, the woman he had married, was betraying him in the most vulgar and explicit way imaginable. The man in the video was younger, more muscular, and dressed in designer clothes. They laughed together, their affair seeming more like a celebration, with Sophia tossing her hair and appearing more alive than Hector had seen her in months. His heart pounded, a mixture of rage and pain building into something uncontrollable. He felt like a stranger in his own life, watching the destruction of his marriage unfold on a screen. Hector's hands trembled as he held the phone, his vision narrowing as he focused on every painful detail. Each laugh, each touch, each moment was like a knife twisting in his gut. He couldn't take it anymore. He threw the phone onto the couch, his breath coming in shallow gasps as the gravity of the situation sunk in. This wasn't just an affair. It was a complete betrayal, right in his face, as if she wanted him to know, as if she didn't care anymore. He stood up abruptly, unable to sit still. His body moved on instinct, driven by the fury and anguish flooding through him. He stormed into the kitchen and yanked open the drawer where they kept the stationery, pulling out a sheet of paper. There was no need to think. The words poured out of him, simple but final. "I'm done. You wanted this. Goodbye." He scribbled his name at the bottom, his hands barely steady enough to write. The ink smeared slightly, but it didn't matter. Clarity wasn't his goal, this was the end. He placed the note on the counter next to the fruit bowl, where Sophia always left her keys. His gaze lingered, the reality of his decision sinking in. This was the home they had built together, the life they had shared, now crumbling in front of him like a house of cards. Hector turned toward the bedroom, each step feeling heavier than the last. The room was silent and empty, but her presence still clung to the air. He opened the closet and pulled down a suitcase from the top shelf, his hands moving with mechanical precision as he packed only the essentials: clothes, toiletries, his laptop. He didn't need much just to get away, far from this place and from her. As he zipped up the suitcase, his phone buzzed again from the living room, a new message. He ignored it. He didn't need to see any more, he had already seen enough. With the suitcase in hand, Hector walked back into the living room. The house was eerily quiet, but a strange calm had begun to settle over him. The anger had faded, replaced by a cold clarity. This was it. He was leaving, and he wasn't coming back. He grabbed his phone from the couch, deliberately avoiding the paused video on the screen, and shoved it into his pocket. The divorce papers would come soon enough. He didn't need to wait for her reaction, her excuses, or her lies. He headed for the front door, pausing for just a moment with his hand on the handle. He glanced back one last time at the home that had once been filled with love and laughter but was now a hollow shell of broken promises. Without another word, Hector opened the door and stepped into the cool night air. The street was quiet, the sky dark, and the door clicked shut softly behind him. The sound barely registered as he walked down the driveway with his suitcase in hand. With each step, a strange sense of relief washed over him. The weight of her betrayal still lingered, but it felt lighter with every step. He didn't know where he was headed, but it didn't matter. Anywhere was better than here. The next day, Hector filed for divorce. There was no confrontation, no emotional showdown. He left the paperwork in the hands of his lawyer and disappeared from Sophia's life without a trace. He didn't need revenge. Watching her suffer wasn't necessary. Walking away and leaving her to the mess she had created was enough. 3 years passed since Hector had walked out of that house and out of Sophia's life for good. In those years, he had dedicated himself to rebuilding not just financially but emotionally too. The journey had been tough at the start, filled with sleepless nights and moments where the sting of betrayal would creep back into Hector's thoughts. But gradually he had started to heal. He moved to a new city, far enough away that memories of Sophia couldn't follow. He initially rented a small apartment, simple yet cozy, a place where he could begin again. Hector threw himself into his work, determined to become something more than the man Sophia had once scornfully called a loser. His investment firm began small, a risk few would have taken. But Hector put his heart and soul into it. Long nights, endless research, and a willingness to take calculated chances eventually began to pay off. Slowly but steadily, his business grew, and so did his self-confidence. He was no longer the man who couldn't afford expensive handbags or luxury trips. He was building a future this time, on his own terms. By the end of the 3rd year, Hector had moved into a sleek, modern condo overlooking the city, a far cry from the suburban house he had once shared with Sophia. His firm had expanded, and now his clients trusted him with millions. He had finally reached the financial success that Sophia had once ridiculed him for lacking. But for Hector, it wasn't just about the money. The real triumph was rediscovering who he was. He had built a circle of true friends, people who had been there for him during his toughest moments. He found joy in the little things: early morning runs by the waterfront, quiet dinners with friends, or simply relaxing in his apartment with a good book and a glass of wine. It was a calm, simple life, but it was his, and that was enough. One day, while sitting at his kitchen table, enjoying his coffee and going through the mail, Hector spotted an envelope that made his heart skip. The handwriting was unmistakable. It was Sophia's. How did she know his address? For a moment, Hector just stared at the envelope, his mind racing with questions. Why now? What could she possibly want after all this time? His first instinct was to toss it in the trash without even opening it. He had moved on, hadn't he? But curiosity got the better of him. The letter shook in his hands as he unfolded it, his fingers trembling slightly. Despite everything he had been through, he hadn't expected this. He hadn't expected to hear from Sophia again, let alone receive a letter pleading for his attention. He scanned the first few lines, his eyes narrowing at her desperate tone. "Dear Hector, I don't even know how to begin this letter. I thought I had everything, the life I wanted, the luxury, the excitement, but it all fell apart. I made a mistake, Hector, a huge mistake." Hector let out a slow breath, already predicting where this was headed. He had seen this story play out before with friends, colleagues, people chasing temporary highs only to crash back to reality when it was too late. But he never imagined Sophia would be one of them. The woman who once thought herself superior to everyone else, who left him behind for a life she deemed better. "The man I left you for," she continued, "he dumped me. He moved on to someone younger, prettier. I thought I was special to him, that I meant something, but I was just another woman in a long line of others. Now I have nothing." Hector paused, a mix of emotions swirling inside him. Part of him felt tempted to pity her, but the stronger part couldn't help but feel the bitter satisfaction of karma catching up to her. She had made her choice, abandoning him for someone who offered her nothing more than material wealth and fleeting attention, and now that world had crumbled. "I'm living in a tiny, run-down apartment," she wrote. "I can barely afford the rent. I've sold most of the things I thought would make me happy just to get by, and the people I thought were my friends? They're all gone. I'm completely alone, Hector." He chuckled bitterly at the irony. The woman who once surrounded herself with wealth and status was now left with nothing, abandoned by the same people who had fed her illusions about the importance of money and prestige. He could picture her now, sitting in some dingy apartment, clinging to the remnants of the life she had so eagerly thrown away. The thought didn't bring him joy, just a grim sense of closure. Hector set the letter down on the table, rubbing a hand over his face. For years he had wondered if Sophia ever regretted her decision, if she ever thought about the life they could have had. And now, here was her confession, her plea for forgiveness. But it was too late. His mind flashed back to that night 3 years ago, the memory of her in that red bikini, mocking him, sneering at him as she left to meet another man. She had called him a loser, throwing her affair in his face as if it was some twisted badge of honor. That memory had haunted him for so long, but now it felt distant, like a story he had read long ago, not something he had lived through. The letter continued, each line dripping with desperation. I miss you, Hector. I miss us. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but can we talk? Please. I don't know what to do anymore. I was wrong, and I see that now. I'm sorry, I really am. Hector leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. Sorry, the word felt empty, too late to make any difference. She hadn't been sorry when she was living it up with her lover, flaunting her new life in front of him. She hadn't been sorry when she abandoned him to pick up the pieces of the life they had built together, and now, when she had nothing left, now she was sorry. He picked up the letter again, rereading the final lines. I need your help, Hector. I don't have anyone else to turn to. For a brief moment he wondered what she thought would happen. Did she expect him to swoop in and rescue her from the mess she had made? Did she think he would just forget everything, forgive her, and let her back into his life as if nothing had ever happened? He stood up, pacing the room, his thoughts swirling. 3 years ago her betrayal had nearly shattered him. He had spent countless nights lying awake, questioning what he had done wrong and why he wasn't enough. But now, as he stood here, the man he had become, Hector realized something: he didn't need her anymore. He had moved on, rebuilding his life from the ground up and finding success on his own terms. He had learned to be happy without her, to thrive without the weight of her betrayal weighing him down, and now, holding this letter, he realized he had won not by wealth or status, but by finding peace within himself, by learning to value what truly mattered. He had surrounded himself with genuine friends, people who supported him regardless of his bank balance or what he wore. He had built a life of substance, not one of superficial glamour, something Sophia would never grasp. With a quiet resolve, Hector neatly folded the letter and placed it back on the counter. He wasn't going to reply. There was nothing left to say. He had once given her everything, and she had thrown it away. Now it was her turn to face the consequences of her decisions. He walked over to the window, gazing at the city below as the sun began to set, casting a soft orange glow over the skyline. The world was moving forward, and so was he. The pain of the past was behind him, and the future stretched out before him, full of promise. Karma had taken its course, and as Hector stood there, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years: freedom. A few days after receiving Sophia's letter, Hector found himself standing outside a small coffee shop in the heart of the city. He had debated whether or not to meet her, but a part of him wanted to see her one final time, not to reconcile, but to close the chapter once and for all. He had nothing left to prove to her, but he still sought closure, a chance to say goodbye for good. Glancing at his watch, he noted she was late, as usual. It was a habit he remembered all too well, always making him wait, as if her time was somehow more valuable than his. But this time, Hector wasn't anxious or impatient. He sipped his coffee slowly, watching the people pass by on the busy street, the hum of the city distant in his mind. He was at peace, and nothing Sophia could say or do would change that. When the door to the cafe finally opened and Sophia entered, Hector almost didn't recognize her. The woman before him was a shadow of her former self, gone were the designer clothes, expensive handbags, and the aura of superiority she once carried. In their place was a worn-out jacket and a messy ponytail. She looked tired, fragile, and beaten down by life. For a brief moment, Hector felt a pang of sympathy. But then he remembered the same woman had walked out on him, laughed in his face, belittled him, and left him to pick up the pieces of their broken marriage. He couldn't afford to pity her now. Hector, she said softly, her voice shaking as she approached the table. She glanced down, avoiding eye contact, her hands nervously gripping the strap of her worn purse. Thank you for meeting me. He nodded, motioning for her to sit. I'm here. Say what you need to say. Sophia sat down slowly, her hands trembling slightly as she placed her purse on the table. She looked up at him with tearful eyes, her face etched with guilt and regret. Hector, I know I don't deserve this. I know I hurt you, and I'm sorry. Truly I am. Hector leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. You're sorry now, after everything. She bit her lip, tears brimming in her eyes. I was wrong. I thought I could have it all. I thought leaving you was the answer, that I could find happiness with him. But it wasn't real, none of it was real, she said, wiping at her eyes, her voice breaking. He left me, Hector. He used me, and then he moved on to someone else. I'm alone, I'm broke. I have nothing left. For a moment, the only sound between them was the soft clinking of cups and the low chatter of the cafe. Hector looked at her. The proud woman who had cast him aside like a discarded toy was now sitting across from him, broken. He could see the depth of her regret, the weight of her choices. But he had made his own choices too. You thought you could walk all over me, Hector said, his voice steady but firm. You thought you could humiliate me, toss me aside like I was nothing, and then come back when everything fell apart. He leaned forward slightly, locking eyes with her. That's not how it works, Sophia. She winced at his words, her tears now flowing freely. I know. I was selfish. I was stupid. I see that now. I thought I needed all those things, the money, the gifts, the lifestyle, but in the end, none of it mattered. She said, reaching across the table, her hand trembling as she tried to touch his. Please, Hector. I made a mistake. I miss you. I miss you. I miss us. Can we try again, please? Hector pulled his hand away, shaking his head. Her touch, once something he had longed for, now felt foreign. He could see the desperation in her eyes, the plea for salvation, but it wasn't his responsibility to save her anymore. You don't miss me, he said quietly. You miss what you lost, the security, the comfort. You miss having someone who cared about you. But that's gone, Sophia. You killed it when you walked out on me. Her face crumpled, her sobs quiet but heavy as she trembled, trying to hold herself together. I don't know what to do anymore, she whispered. I don't know how to fix this. Hector stood up, grabbing his coat. As he prepared to leave, he looked down at her, seeing the broken person she had become. But there was no satisfaction in it for him. This wasn't about revenge or watching her suffer, it was about finally letting go of the last piece of the past that had haunted him. You can't fix this, he said, his voice firm but not cruel. You made your choice and now you have to live with it, just like I had to live with what you did to me. She looked up at him through her tears, her eyes pleading. Please, Hector. Don't leave me like this. I'm begging you. Hector was already heading for the door, but he paused briefly and turned to look at her one final time. I've moved on, he said, his voice steady and firm. You should too with that. He left the cafe, stepping into the cool air outside. The sound of Sophia's quiet sobs faded behind him, overtaken by the bustling noise of the city. As Hector walked down the street, he felt a strange lightness, as if a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. The past was finally behind him, completely and utterly. For the first time in years, Hector felt truly free. He never looked back. That day marked the closing of a painful chapter in his life. When the door to the cafe shut behind him, it felt as though the door to his past had closed as well. There was no longer any need to dwell on Sophia's mistakes or her downfall. Instead, Hector focused on living the life he had rebuilt, one filled with peace, self-respect, and a hard-earned sense of stability. In the months following that final meeting, Hector threw himself into his work. His investment firm continued to thrive, evolving from a risky endeavor into a highly successful venture. His career flourished as he built trust with his clients through honesty and hard work. But more than his professional achievements, Hector found comfort in the everyday moments of life, something that had been absent during the turmoil of his marriage. Every morning he made time for himself, starting his day with a coffee and a jog along the waterfront, savoring the peace and quiet. The pressure of trying to meet someone else's expectations that had never truly reflected who he was gone. For the first time in a long while, Hector's success wasn't about proving anything to anyone, it was simply about enjoying the fruits of his own hard work. He also forged new friendships after cutting ties with the toxic elements of his past. Hector surrounded himself with people who uplifted him, who valued him for who he was, not for what he could offer. These friendships were genuine, based on mutual respect, and shared experiences, an entirely different dynamic from the superficiality that had defined his relationship with Sophia. While Hector moved forward with his life, Sophia's situation continued to deteriorate. The luxury and glamour that once surrounded her life vanished quickly after her lover left her. Without the gifts, designer clothes, and extravagant dinners, Sophia had to face a harsh reality. She had exchanged something solid for something temporary. Her new apartment was far from the high-end lifestyle she used to flaunt, it was cramped and in poor condition. She scraped by, taking on odd jobs here and there, never quite finding stable footing. The attention she once relished, the compliments, the envy, the admiration had all disappeared. She was left alone with no one to blame but herself. During this time, Sophia often thought about Hector. She wondered what might have happened if she hadn't left him, if she hadn't pursued the thrill and luxury her lover had promised, but she knew it was too late. The memory of their last meeting in the cafe replayed in her mind constantly. His calm yet final words echoed in her thoughts. You made your choice, Sophia. Now you have to live with it, and live with it she did every day. Sophia woke up to the painful realization that she had thrown away something real, something that could have lasted. The excitement she had felt when she walked out of Hector's house that night in a bikini now seemed absurd. What had it gotten her? Nothing but isolation and regret. She thought about reaching out to him again, but knew it would be pointless. He had moved on, and she was left to face the ruins of the life she had built on vanity and selfishness. Meanwhile, Hector found love again, several years after his divorce when he least expected it. He met Claire, who was everything Sophia wasn't. Kind, supportive, and most importantly, someone who valued Hector for who he was, not for what he could give her. Their relationship grew gradually, based on trust and mutual respect. With Claire, Hector didn't feel the need to prove himself, nor was he weighed down by the fear of being inadequate. They traveled together, exploring new places, sharing laughter in a way Hector hadn't experienced in years. The warmth that had been missing from his life for so long returned with Claire, and each day spent with her reminded Hector of what a true partnership should be, something he had once thought was impossible after the betrayal he had endured. As the years went by, Sophia became nothing more than a distant memory for Hector. The pain of her betrayal had long since faded, replaced by the joy and fulfillment he found in his new life. She was merely a lesson now, a reminder of how fragile and fleeting superficial desires could be. But beyond that, Sophia represented the danger of chasing temporary thrills at the expense of something meaningful. Hector had no desire for revenge, no need to see her suffer. Life had taken care of that for him. His triumph didn't come from spite or vengeance, it came from moving on, from finding happiness and peace after the storm she had caused. In the end, Hector lived the life he deserved, a life filled with love, success, and contentment. His closure didn't come from getting even, it came from walking away and never looking back. For Sophia, life never fully recovered. Her choices led her down a path of loneliness and regret, and she had to live with the consequences every single day. The luxury, the attention, the designer bags, those things had been fleeting. Now, she was left with nothing but the memories of what could have been, while Hector continued to thrive, knowing she had been the architect of her own downfall.